Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and in this video I'm going to show you how to set up, install and wire the Corsair H170i RGB iCue Link all-in-one cooler. As you can see here, I'm actually going to upgrade it as well with different fans and a VRM fan, and I'm also going to show you the wiring logic and setup for all of that in this system. I'm going to show you Intel and AMD setups. I'm also going to show you it top-mounted and side-mounted, and how to do that and the thought process behind it, and what to do in iCue later on as well. So all of these things will be timestamped so you can jump to the relevant points, and I'll leave links in the description that will also be helpful to other videos that are related to this. But obviously the iCue Link H170i RGB comes in black as standard. A 420mm cooler that you need to make sure will fit in your case. I'm using the HAVN HS420 VGPU for this build, so it will indeed fit in there, either top mounted or side mounted, but it is obviously a large all-in-one cooler. Now this is designed to work with Corsair's iCue Link fans. I'm going to be adding additional fans into the system, so I'll talk you through the process of that and how to do it, but I'm also going to link to a video I've done on iCue Link wiring in the description in case you get confused or you need additional help, because there is a lot of depth to go into there. Now, when you're first unboxing it, take care not to do what I'm about to do, which is to accidentally pull off the plastic protective housing over the top of the pump. You can see what I've done there is I've managed to damage the thermal paste ever so slightly in the corner there. So you need to make sure this plastic cap is in place throughout most of your build until the very last minute so that it doesn't get damaged. As you can see, the fans on the radiator are pre-installed and they're set to exhaust, so it'll actually be blowing through the radiator and logically out of the top of your case if you're top mounting it. So pretty standard and straightforward for you. On the radiator, you'll find several ports, one including the USB-C port that you won't need potentially, and then two additional ports for connecting the fans up and then connecting the radiator and the pump to the controller that you can see here. So we've got several cables that need to be plugged in. For ease of viewing, I'm going to lay these all out for you and make it really clear for you how to do it. Obviously, you'd install everything and wire it up once it's installed in the case, so I'll show you that later on as well. This controller is able to control up to 24 iCue Link devices, 12 on each port on the left and right hand side. You then have additional cables that you need to plug into that to power it and connect things up. You get this small cable which connects from the fans to the radiator, and then a longer one which connects from the radiator to the iCue Link controller. So those things then connect up nicely together and ensure the power and lighting goes through properly. You then have this PCIe power adapter which requires to connect to your power supply unit, and I'll show you how to wire that up later on, and USB connection, which is important so that you can control everything via Corsair's iCue software. And so it's essential that you plug both of those connectors in, and then you have this small connector which connects to the control box and to the CPU fan header on your motherboard to ensure the motherboard can detect that you've got a cooler in place. Now you have the small connector that I was talking about. Make sure that you connect it up to the fan. Notice there's a little thing sticking out of this connector here. On the other side, you'll find there's a blank connection, so don't plug it in on the wrong side. Plug it in there, make sure it connects up properly, and then plug it into the radiator. So this is passing the signal from the fans to the radiator, and then the other cable plugs into the radiator and passes through to the controller. So you can see that here. You have these little plastic tabs on there so you can easily pull those out and adjust them if necessary. There's also a USB-C connection on the radiator, but that's only necessary if you have the LCD screen for the cooler. So the long cable then plugs into one of the ports on the iCue Link controller. This controller can also be used for additional fans in the case. As you've seen, I've got additional fans that I'm going to be plugging in here, including standard blade and reverse blade fans, and they'll plug in and daisy chain up on the other side. Now, just a quick look at the cabling again, make it nice and easy for you. I'm going to show you this inside the build later on, but I want to make it nice and clear. Make sure you plug these cables in on the controller, so the CPU fan header, the USB connection, and then the power connector. You need to make sure these are all plugged in on the controller that you're going to be using here and connected up properly. So I want to show you where to wire those up and how to connect them up. I want to do it now so it's really easy and visible to see, and you can understand the logic of how it works to make sure you get everything plugged in properly. So 3 cables, fairly straightforward, with perhaps the PCIe power cable being a little bit more tricky, so it's worth bearing that in mind. For reference, I'm using the Maximus Hero Z890 motherboard, which you can see the CPU fan header is on the top right of. That's mostly the same across most modern motherboards. We just need to plug that little cable into it so that your motherboard recognizes there's a cooler installed and the BIOS doesn't complain and it boots nicely and you don't have any issues there. So that's that connection. Then you have the USB cable, which plugs in the bottom and middle usually on most modern motherboards. On this one, it's slightly off to the right, but you should find it's got a USB marking on it there. And you'll notice that there's 1 pin missing on the motherboard and on the cable, so you can only plug it in one way. So you make sure you plug that in. Now, for demonstration purposes of the powering, I'm going to use this Leland Edge power supply unit, which I'm going to do a separate wiring guide on, but you can also use a Corsair power supply. This is just for demonstration purposes. What's important is you're going to need one of the PCIe power cables that you'd usually use for your graphics card for the controller. So you need to make sure you've got a spare one of those. You can see that this power supply comes with 4 of these cables, so it shouldn't be an issue. Now on one end this is marked PSU, on the other end PCIe, but it plugs into the PCIe port on modular power supply on one end. Make sure it's fully secured. On the other end you'll find it splits into 2 parts. This is the 6-pin part, which needs to plug into the adapter for the iCue Link controller. You'll notice there's a little plastic notch on it and a hook that goes over the top of that. It's a little bit fiddly, but you do need to make sure that's pushed all the way in and secured properly, and then that will ensure you get power. Now we're going to go on to the AMD AM5 socket setup, and then I'll get to Intel in a second. But you can see that you will require additional bracketing and you get some standoff screws included in the box. The first step is to remove the standard pre-installed standoffs from your motherboard, which has 4 screws on it, so you need to remove those screws, and then the plastic brackets that come installed on the motherboard as standard. Get those out of the way because we're not going to be using those. Then you have the standoffs. If you look closely, you'll notice on one side the threading is slightly fatter than on the other side. This is important to note because those are the parts that are going to screw into the holes on the motherboard where we removed the previous standoffs. You need to make sure you put them in the right way around, otherwise they won't fit properly and they will be loose, which will then mean that the cooler's not secured down properly. So make sure you put those into all 4 corners. Next up, we're going to install the CPU. If you haven't already, lift the latch up and then gently seat your CPU down in the socket. Make sure you line up those little plastic notches with the holes on the CPU so it makes it easy to line up, but very, very gently seat those down in there because you don't want to damage any of the pins on the motherboard. Then put the latch back down and secure the lever in place to make sure that's all nicely secured as well. And then that's prepped and ready to go. Next, you need to remove the pre-installed bracketing from the cooler itself because that's for the Intel build. So we want to use these straight brackets instead. Slot those in place, obviously taking care not to damage the thermal paste at this point as well, because you do need to remove the plastic cover in order to do this, so you should leave this till the last second. And then you'd seat that down over the top of the CPU, making sure to line up the standoffs, and then we'll use these thumb screws to secure that in each of the 4 corners. Now I'm showing you this outside the case. Obviously you'd wait until it was fully installed in the system, but you make sure you tighten those up nicely and secure it down. Now we're onto an Intel build. I'm showing you an 1851 socket motherboard, but this will work with LGA 1700 socket and other hardwares also included in the box. For this one, we're going to use the LGA 1700 backplate. So you peel off the little 3M sticker cover off the back of that, adjust the notches on the backplate itself, and then secure it through the motherboard. Now I'm doing this outside of the case, so it's really easy to see and to access so that you can easily connect this up and plug it in. You might be able to do it inside your case if you've already installed the motherboard, but it's just a little bit less fiddly like this, I find, and it's easier to secure without any issues. And then flip it over and you'll see we have some standoff screws that need to be secured in place. 4 standoff screws that are the same length and thickness on either side, so it doesn't matter which way around you put them, but secure those into the 4 holes from that back plate that have come through there. You need to make sure you secure them nice and tight so they're nice and secure in those sockets. Make sure you do that in all 4 corners so it's all secured up nicely and ready, and then the cooler is going to sit down over the top of that once we've gone about the installation process into the system. So I'm going to show you the steps for doing that. So obviously installing the motherboard into the case and then securing it down onto the standoffs in the case as well, and making sure that's ready. And then we're going to get to the installation of the other bits. So fairly straightforward initial setup. Now, as mentioned, I'm going to be using different fans in the system. So I'm using the LX140 RGB and the reverse blade fans in this version. And these can be connected up and daisy chained together with various different cables. The dual pack comes with its own controller, and I do end up actually using this controller. But if you're lucky, depending on the case, you might be able to use just one controller, depending on how many case fans you're putting in. So you can see in this initial build how we've got this set up. I've got 4 reverse blade fans across the bottom and then standard fans across the top. But I'm also going to get to how to do it with reverse blade fans when you side mount the all-in-one cooler as well. So I'll show you that a little later on. Now, I'm swapping out the fans here, which isn't necessary, obviously. I'm just doing it because I have them and because I want to create that sort of contrasty build with the black and white fans in the case, because it's a black cooler, white fans, and I've got white fans throughout the rest of it. Now, these are the standard blade fans, so the same logic applies. If you're taking off your standard fans to install white ones like this, for example, make sure you line up the connectors in the same way, so the connectors are on the same ends as they would have been. What I'm going to be doing first of all is top mounting the all-in-one cooler with the tubes on the right hand side so they don't interfere with the rear fans. And also this case, it's kind of spacious on the right as well, so they're not going to get in the way of anything else, and it ends up looking okay, and it's pretty easy to fit in this orientation. You do need to think about where your cabling's going though for the other fans and how the rad's going to connect up. And I'll talk more about that as we go through. If you have it, remove the radiator bracketing from the top of your case, which it does in this instance. And then what we're going to do is secure that bracket to the radiator. Obviously, you could also screw the radiator directly to the case if you don't have a removable bracket. Then you use the smaller screws that are included with the cooler and the washers to screw through into the holes on the top of the radiator, securing that down and making sure that all we use secure the various different holes in the system, and so that the rad is ready to go. So you can see that set up now, ready to be inserted back into the case. What I'd recommend doing is making sure you have any cabling from other fans running through. So I've got fan cable from the rear fan here, for example, running through to the back there. I've adjusted it so it'll be easy to access, because what I'm going to do is plug those rear fans into the fans on the radiator, and then obviously the fans on the radiator are connected to the radiator, and then the radiator is connected to the controller, and this way you can daisy chain the fans together. Then just go about re-securing the bracketing for the radiator, and at this point I remembered that I'd forgotten to plug the little cables in for the new fans to the rad, and then obviously run the other cable from the rad to the controller. It's much easier to do before you install it into the case, so don't make the same mistake that I did. Follow that initial setup that I showed you beforehand. Then run the long cable from the radiator through to the rear, where we're going to plug it into the controller, so into the iCue Link controller. As a reminder, this is controlling multiple devices from one cable. If you have a good case that's easy to wire in, you can theoretically plug loads of things in there, but we'll get to that in a second. Now, for the standard Intel installation with the standard brackets that are pre-installed, you take the plastic cap off and then seat it down. But you also want to remove the sticky plastic around the cooler itself so that it looks nice when it's installed. Now we're going to seat that down over the standoffs. Notice I've got the tubes on the right-hand side here. They're not interfering with the RAM, so there's no worries there. You can just secure that down. Then use the thumb screws to secure each of the 4 corners down. I usually go corner to corner, opposite corners, so top right, bottom left, bottom right. Secure those, and then I'd recommend using a screwdriver to make sure they're tightened up fully. You don't want to over tighten these. You don't want to force it, but what you do want to do is just keep screwing until they won't screw any further. That makes sure it's nice and secure and there's no issues there. Now, an additional optional purchase is this VRM fan, which I'm using here because it looks really nice with the setup we've got. So you can just pull off the standard cap and install this. I'll link to a video I did on that separately in the description. And then I'm running the cables from some of the other case fans into one side of the iCue Link controller. And then we're going to plug in the one from the radiator into this in a second as well. Now, this controller is actually magnetic, so if you've got a metal case, it will actually just connect to the back. but sadly this one has a plastic housing on it. But that's okay because there's 3M stickers included in the box with the cooler that you can stick to the back of the controller. So double-sided tape, peel off the other bits, and then you can secure it to the back of the case. This is obviously handy for cable management and making sure your controller doesn't just fall out of the case when you're going about the installation process, and to make sure everything's connected up nicely. So just got to find a good spot for it. Do bear in mind how long the cables are though. So the USB cable, for example, isn't particularly long, and neither is the CPU fan connection. So if you put it too far top or bottom, you'll find the cables won't stretch far enough. So I'd recommend checking the length and the distance beforehand. Then we can plug the cable from the radiator into the other port on the controller, and that's then set up with the cabling from both lots of fans easily connected up. And then we run the cable from the USB connection through to the motherboard. And don't forget the all-important other cables as well, like the CPU connection and more. And I'm going to show you how to control all the fans and other things in iCue a little later on, including the fan speed and RGB lighting. But the PCIe power cable, we need to make sure that's plugged in and fully connected, so do make sure you push that all the way in. It is a little bit fiddly, it can be a little bit fiddly, but make sure you just get that in there and fully seated so that everything's getting power nicely. If you find your fans aren't spinning, it could well be that that's just not plugged in properly. And then the CPU cable from that controller plugs into the CPU fan header, which, as you can see, is a little bit fiddly in this instance, so you do need to think about that during this build process. There's not much space there behind the radiator now to plug this in, so it can be a little bit fiddly to do. In some cases, you might even have to do it before you even install the radiator. It's something to bear in mind, can be a bit problematic and just awkward to do. The USB connection goes to the bottom middle of the motherboard, and make sure that's plugged in as well, otherwise you won't be able to control everything with iCue, so that's really important that you get that connected up. And then you should find that everything turns on nicely. Now, if you find that some of the fans don't light up properly, it could be because the firmware needs to be updated on the controller. So just bear that in mind. Don't panic. The original firmware basically only allowed you to put 7 things on each port. Now you can do 12 with updated firmware. So just go into Windows, download iCue, and then run the firmware update from iCue, and then you should find everything works nicely, and that'll be sorted out. Now, what I'm going to do now is, instead of top mounting it, we're going to go for a side mount. Now, I usually find that side mounting an intake radiator keeps the CPU running cool and is also beneficial, so I want to show you how to do that if you're thinking about doing the same. Now, in this case, with this cooler, I'm going to end up mounting it like this so that the tubes are at the top, and the reason for that is the length of them will otherwise interfere with the GPU which I'm using, because I'm going to be using a 5090 in there. You can see if you mount it with the tubes at the bottom, which I know some people prefer, you will find that there's not much length in those tubes, and they're also probably going to get in the way of your graphics card, at least in this case as well. So you can see this 5090 Astral, for example, from Asus, is not much space behind it, even with the vertical mount, because it's so fat. So I knew that was going to be an issue. Now I'm going to use the LX140R, which are the reverse blade fans. So you could use the standard fans and just flip them over so that the front faces the radiator and the back can be seen in the case instead. But the reverse blade fans means that you can carry on seeing the fan blades and the nice design there. So I'm going to use those instead. So basically removing the fans that I previously installed for the top mount and installing the reverse blade fans on it, making sure once again to ensure that the connectors are in the same position. So you want to make sure that the top and bottom connectors that connect to the radiator and to other fans in the system are in the same place, because it will just make the process a lot easier. So that was one of the things I watched out for, so you can plug that little connector back in from the radiator, for example. Just put those fans on the rad and then use the long radiator screws to secure them once again. As mentioned, this is my preference. I've actually found in testing in various different cases that the cooling on this, like this, with intake fans on the radiator, is actually preferable for both the CPU temps and the overall system temperatures. But I'm going to do a review on this cooler in the near future to show you how the performance got on in this build, and it'll obviously vary from case to case. But the logic here is similar to what we did a minute ago. We're going to use the small screws with the washers to secure the radiator to the side of the case now, so it can secure to this radiator tray. You can take the tray out and install it, so if you want to do it rather than the way I have. If you want to just do it straight away, then you can do is you can take that out and just install it like we did earlier on, and then you got that set up. And then you can see the tubes are a little bit messier here. I actually end up using a Velcro tie to tidy those up, but they're not going to get in the way of the graphics card in this instance. So we need to make sure those cables are plugged in again. So that long cable that we plugged to the controller, need to make sure that's plugged into the radiator, and the cable from the radiator is plugged into the fans, which you can see I have done. And then the fans that I was using on the radiator are now going on the top as exhaust fans instead. So same sort of logic here. I'm using the iCue link cable from the back fans to plug into this, and so I can still make sure that it's all connected up nicely. But the problem I had here, and the reason I'm showing this, is because I've added extra fans into the system, and because the way the case is designed, I actually end up having to use 2 controllers because there was no way to run the cables from this to the radiator anymore because of the space at the top and bottom when it's mounted on the side. So in theory, you can still connect up these all and just use 1 controller, but I ended up using 2 now just for ease, which is obviously going to vary from case to case. My recommendation here is essentially to plan out your build, make sure you work out which cables are going to go from which fan to the next, and whether you can get away with just using 1 controller. Because obviously now I've got to use 2, which means I need 2 PCIe power cables spare, which actually isn't an issue because there's a 12-volt iPower connector for this cable for the 5090 anyway, so it's not a problem with the power supply unit. But I also need to make sure the USB connection for both controllers is plugged in. Now, the additional iCue Link controller doesn't require a CPU fan connection, just the PCIe power and the USB connector. Those 2 need to be plugged in, but I need to make sure I've got that for these additional fans that I'm now putting into the system. So it's a little bit more complicated doing it like this, but if you plan out your build a bit better than I did, or you've got a case that makes the wiring a little bit easier with more space, then it should be plausible to do. This case is a little bit more complicated because there's those 2 rear fans which actually plug in the outside of the case, which is fairly unusual. But you can run a cable up to the top of the case in this instance, through a little hole, and then back down into the case to plug into those top fans. So now I've got the rear fans connected up to the top fans, and then the top fans connected from this cable onto that controller. So basically all of the fans on the case are set up so they're running across the bottom ones, the rear and the top are all connected to 1 controller, and then the radiator fans are connected to the standard controller that came with the all-in-one cooler. Now we're going to have a look at iCue. Now my first recommendation is to go into iCue and download the firmware updates. You should be prompted to do it, but you can see I've got 2 system hubs in here, and you should see a little notification for that. If you click on one of the system hubs, you'll then get this little setup wizard with lighting setup, and you'll see that the fans are then color coded basically to let you know which fan is which in the system. So you can see on the fans themselves, so the bottom ones along the bottom and then ones on the radiator on the right hand side, they're color coded. But also you'll notice the ones on the bottom fans have 2 lights on them, the ones on the radiator have a single light on them. So you can see that same representation in iCue. So I can tell from this that 9, 10 and 11 in this group, for example, are the ones on the radiator, and the other 3 are the ones at the bottom of the case. And keep this in mind when you're doing this, because then it'll allow you to set these up in a couple of different ways, because in iCue you can reorder them. Now if you click on the various fans, it'll also highlight them in a brighter color, so it's obvious which one you're clicking on. But essentially you can reposition the fans in here based on those colors, which will then work with the synchronization of RGB lighting throughout the system. So if you've got an effect that wants to go from one fan to the next, to the next, to the next, you can do that. So you can reposition them in the software based on the hardware lighting that you can see in the case, which is a useful tip. Now, if you go into the fan setup under the cooler, you'll find that you get to set the fans that are actually on the radiator. So when running the wizard, I can tell iCue that it's 9, 10, and 11 are the fans that are on the radiator, and the other 3 aren't. That way, obviously, they'll be spun up when the CPU's getting a bit toasty, which is worth knowing. And then you can double check this by just go back into the lighting setup as I show and click on them. Now, once that's done under the cooling section, you can then choose the cooling profile that you want. You can see that the iCue Link fans here are set to balanced. I'd recommend balanced. It does a good job of cooling, but you can go for a quieter option if you prefer. And obviously, you can go through each fan individually or set them all to the same sort of logic in there. Now, when it comes to lighting, the murals lighting effects are the easiest way to apply lighting across the entire thing. So you can see the abstract and then liquid settings. These obviously look nice across a variety of fans and the other devices in there. And you can get that RGB lighting synced up nicely and looking really good in this way. But you can obviously also choose from a variety of other settings. It will just require a little more tweaking. But this is definitely a better way of doing it as a group. But first of all, if you want to change the lighting effects, you have to turn murals off. Then go into the fan settings and you can see the lighting effects in here. Then you've got to delete whatever you've got there as standard, so watercolor spectrum. And then I'd recommend going down and choosing lighting link. That basically ensures that all the iCue link products in there then have the same RGB lighting effects, even if you've got two controllers. So you've got the lighting going across all the fans and syncing up nicely and looking really good by the end of it. Hopefully this has helped with your setup. If it has, let me know in the comments down below and subscribe to see more, especially the review and build guide on these. Thanks very much for watching.